Hello everybody, it's Sarah and today it is time for my last year-end 2021 wrap-up video. I of course already did 3 of these videos. I did a video looking back at my 2021 stats and goals, I did a video talking about my favorite books, and I did my video talking about my least favorite / most disappointing reads of 2021. And today, as the title will tell you, it is time to talk about my favorite rereads as well as my favorite series that I read in 2021. And yes, this video purely has the motivation behind it that I had more space on my favorite books video, because quite a few of the books that I will talk about in this video, especially when it comes to entries and series, would actually have been in that other video, but you know, I can't talk about 20 books in my favorite books of 2021 video. I mean, I could, but that video was already 50 minutes long as it is, and I was only talking about 11 books. So anyway, let's try to take care that this video doesn't get 50 minutes long, because my worst books was also 43 minutes long, so let's see if I'll manage. But anyway, if you haven't seen any of my other videos yet, I have a playlist of all my year-end videos, and that playlist is linked down below and up there. So go and check it out and just look at which videos you haven't seen yet. And now let's get started with rereads. The reason why I wanted to do a favorite rereads list this year is because I read around 60 books this year that were rereads. I reread around 60 books this year. A third of which was Brandon Sanderson, some of which was in one of my other videos. I won't tell you if it was my favorites or my worst books, but I think you'll get a feeling which one it was from what I'm gonna talk about now, or in a minute. But anyway, I reread 60 books this year, which 2 years ago was the amount of books I read in total in a year. So safe to say, I think it's fair for me to do a favorite rereads video. And so let's get started with those. I will talk about my series list and how I chose my favorite series later on when I'll get to them. But first, let's start with my favorite rereads, and let's start with the Brandon Sanderson rereads that surprisingly did make it onto this list. The first of those is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in his Skyward series. And yes, while Cytonic made it onto my most disappointing reads list of 2021, when I reread Skyward, I found it 100% absolutely solid. And I in fact now would probably say that this is my favorite Brandon Sanderson novel. Now, Skyward is Brandon Sanderson's YA space opera. I won't go into, you know, summaries to books in this video because I think that will be too long. I will talk about some summaries when I come to my series, but not for my reads. So let me just tell you, this is his YA space opera. And for me personally, first of all, this was the 3rd time that I read this, so my second reread, 3rd time I read it. And I just think this is still a really, really solid book. I think Spencer's character arc is amazing. I think the characterization of all the side characters is really solid as well. There's a good, solid mystery behind this first novel without focusing too much on it yet, because we're still very much focused on building up the world and building up the situation in which all the characters live in. And yeah, I just really think it's a well done book. And I think honestly this is where Brandon Sanderson shines the most in his writing, because first of all, the characters are amazing. I mean, characters in Brandon Sanderson's novels are always pretty great. Characterization pretty much, I think, is the strongest point in Brandon Sanderson's writing. But then additionally to that, Brandon Sanderson's fast-paced writing really is suitable for a YA novel, or really suits itself for a YA novel, so that's really good. Then of course Brandon Sanderson has a writing style that I would say is a non-writing style, because he does have this goal of being very approachable to new fantasy readers as well, which I would say comes at a detriment to it being, you know, very recognizable in its writing and having like the feeling that the language is used very purposefully. It's kind of hard to explain, but you know. Brandon Sanderson has a non-writing style, is what I'm saying, which I think personally, for me at least, I think is better suited to YA fiction rather than adult fiction. And I mean, I still prefer YA novels that have a recognizable writing style, but you know, I also don't mind that it doesn't have that. And then lastly, I think his world building is just way better in YA as well, because yes, Brandon Sanderson is for some reason known for his world building, but his world building usually is more on a, you know, magical, physical level, if anything. And he ignores big parts of what make world building important, which has been an issue on my reread this time around. However, again, with YA, I don't need as extensive of a world building, and even though it does get pretty extensive for YA in this series later on, I just think it's, you know, his world building works way better in YA. And so overall, I just think this book is great. I really enjoyed my reread of it. It's, you know, it's the one Brandon Sanderson book that I read this year where I didn't go out feeling like I have way more things to criticize now than I had last year or 2 years ago. So, you know, it's the one Brandon Sanderson book that 100% held up to me. I do, however, still have a second Brandon Sanderson reread on this list, and that is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. With this one, I'm not quite as positive as for Skyward, because there are some criticisms I have. Like, I've heard now criticisms a lot about the way chronic pain is dealt with within this book, and the development of the chronic pain within this book. I have now heard criticisms about the one autistic character in this book, which I didn't even know that character was autistic, so I would say that's some fair criticism. So, you know, it's not as perfect for me. However, this is the one Cosmere novel for me that still does get better on reread. And I think, once again, it's for reasons similar to Skyward. First of all, this is a standalone. So far, at least, it is a standalone. And I believe even if we get a sequel, I don't think we're gonna follow the same characters and follow the same story in the sequel. So this is a finished story on its own. And yes, while there are some parts of the world building that could be expanded upon, it's 100% enough for what the story is. We don't need any more world building. I do enjoy the characters, I do enjoy the character development. There's some issues I have with some of the characters, but they are rather on the minor side. And overall, as I said, this is the one Cosmere novel that I read or reread on this reread of my Cosmere reread journey. I don't know, I didn't make sense there, but this was the one reread during my Cosmere reread where I feel like I enjoyed it a little bit more once again than on my previous reads. And this I also reread for the third time. Not reread, I read it for the third time, so it was my second reread. And so yeah, I just think that this is now my favorite Brandon Sanderson Cosmere novel. It doesn't have my favorite characters. I think it probably has some of the characters that I care the least about, but it just tells me a lot that I still think the story is really solid, that it doesn't matter that I'm not head over heels for all of the characters. Next, I had my rereads of the Black Magician series by Trudy Canavan. My favorite book probably being the first one, which is The Magician's Guild. And this one, I cannot tell you how many times I've read it, because it's one of my long time favorites. It was one of the first adult high fantasy stories that I have ever read. This probably is also one of the fantasy stories where, at least in the first book, there's some elements, or also a little bit in the second book, because there's a school setting that has some elements that are good for readers who want to cross over into adult fiction from YA fiction. Although I do think that this is more on the adult side, just from themes and structure and development of the story rather than YA. And yeah, I reread this and I once again wasn't disappointed. I would say both the first and the second book are the two books that I really enjoyed on my reread. The third book I also enjoyed, but I just still don't like the ending of this series. And I think I like the ending even less this time around because it just makes me angry and it just makes me depressed. Like, it's not a bad ending, but there's one thing that happens in the ending that I'm really not okay with. And that makes me really upset. So, you know, and I think it's illogical that it happened, so anyway. Third book doesn't make it onto my list, but the first two definitely do. The second book, by the way, is The Novice, I believe it is called. And yeah, why I enjoyed this book so much, once again on the reread, and why it holds up for me, by the way, I do have a full review of this, which I will leave linked down below and up there. If I have a review for any of the series or books, once again, they will all be linked down below. But the reason why I enjoyed this on a reread again and why it holds up for me is because this is a really character-focused story that I really enjoy, with a lot of elements from other subgenres within the adult high fantasy umbrella. I don't know where I went with the thought. But anyway, I would not put this solidly into any one subgenre, but there's elements from multiple subgenres. Like, there's some political elements, there's some very interesting societal structural discussions, especially because our main character, like, is from the poor part of town. She's basically from the slums. And so there's some class conflict going on, especially within the first and the second book. I think that the second book, which has kind of a bullying storyline, is really well done. It's a book that was written in the very early 2000s, I believe. Like, this was published 2000 or 2001, no, 2004. This was published 2004, and it has a main character, a POV character, well, not a main character, but a POV character who is a gay man, which, you know, is just amazing. And the representation in this is amazing because it's not stereotypical at all, or not stereotyped whatsoever. And so, yeah, that actually was the thing that I had, like, the most feelings about going into the reread, where it was like, okay, but I haven't read this in a bit. How was the representation? But no, the representation 100% holds up. And so, yeah, there's decent mysteries behind this book, and I just think overall it's a really great story. Next, I have my first reread of the year, which was Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Merrily. I wanted to reread the entirety of the Seven Waters series this year. I did not. I only reread Daughter of the Forest, and this is another one of my old-time favorites that I haven't reread in a while. I can't tell you how often I have read it because I read it a lot. And so now I reread it and I wanted to see if it holds up for me, and it almost 100% does. There's some slight issues that I have with a few things that I can't even remember right now, but there was some few things where I was like, probably don't enjoy this as much anymore, or if I read this for the first time they would bother me more if I didn't have, you know, my nostalgia classes that I do have. I do admit that. But overall, I just think this is just a really great lyrical story that has amazing vibes. Our main character is so fun, so enjoyable. There is trigger warnings for sexual assault and rape. However, I believe the way it is dealt with is really well done because the trauma of the character isn't brushed aside. And yeah, I just generally really enjoyed my reread, and Juliet Merrily always had a beautiful writing style, so that's also something that I really enjoyed. And yeah, I can just highly recommend it still. I also, and this is just a stand-in because I don't have my original trilogy copy here, but I also reread the entirety of the Black Jewels series this year once again. And of course my favorite reread was the trilogy. the second book, which is my favorite in the entire series. The second book is called Heir to the Shadows. I only have the fourth book right here. Maybe some of the later books in the series don't hold up quite as well for me on rereads, where I do get a little bit bored by now when I'm rereading them. But the reason why I wanted to put this on my list is because I also reread The Black Jewels at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, where it was like, I'm not getting the same feelings from this series as I used to. Also, this is another series where I can't tell you how often I've read it. I have 100% read it over 10 times, if not already getting close to 20. Because there was a time when I read this or reread some of the books in this series multiple times a year. So, you know, just as a little info. But yeah, anyway, there's some of the later books that don't hold up as well for me, and when I reread it 2019, 2020, the entire series, I was like, I'm not getting the feelings that I used to get from the series. However, when I reread it this time, all the feelings were there again. And I, of course, when I read this now, I have a lot more criticism of this series than when I first read it at 12 years old, which, by the way, do not recommend. This is not a series for 12 years old. There's multiple trigger warnings, content warnings for rape, child abuse, sexual abuse, pedophilia. I don't know. There's a lot of trigger warnings is what I'm saying. But yeah, so I do have a more realistic view on what this series is as a whole and of criticisms, which I will get into once I review this series, but I want to wait until I have my physical copy of the original trilogy again. So I will get into those issues then. However, feelings-wise, this series this year once again gave me the same feelings of nostalgia and of absolutely loving this, and it's one of my favorite series of all time. It's the series that for the longest time I called my favorite series of all time. So what do you want me to say? And lastly, I just want to quickly mention this because this was already on my list for best books of 2021, but I did also reread it this year, so I need to mention it because I think this was the best reread I did this year, or I had this year, and that was The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. I won't go into why I love this book now because I went into that in my best books of 2021 video, but the reason why I wanted to put this on this list is because when I reread this in December, I just noticed so many more little details and things, and so much more about the world building, about the characters, about the plot, hints that were given at the very beginning of the book already in terms of the plot, in terms of, you know, something that's gonna happen later on down the line. And I just absolutely love that. I love this book so much more the second time around than I did it the first time, and it already was a solid 5-star read the first time I read it. So, you know, it just, I had to mention that this was absolutely one of my favorite rereads this year. So now that we're done with my rereads, let's continue on to my favorite series. Just like my rereads list, this will not be ranked. Also, as I said, my motivation basically was that some of these books would have made it onto my favorites of 2021 list, but I didn't want the list to get too long, so I just put the series as a whole, because in most cases for these books I loved the series as a whole this year, onto this list. Although last year I had my most surprising books of the year list as a kind of, you know, cheat to have more favorite books. I will not tell you if books would have made it onto my favorites of 2021 list and which rank they would have had, which I did last year. And so let me tell you what I looked for in a series. Well, not what I looked for content-wise in a series, but, you know, what were the criteria for me to think about whether or not I want to put the book onto this list. And basically the very basic criteria is I had to read the majority of the books that are published in this series this year. So more than half of the books. Either the series as a whole is already published and I read the entirety of the series or the majority of the series this year, or the series is not published yet as a whole, but I am caught up to the series, or I caught up to the series and I read the majority of those books again this year, or just generally. I read the majority of the books this year, even if I'm not caught up yet or whatever. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. So let's start maybe with the few series that I have. There's 2 of them in total where I have finished the entire series, and I actually started the series this year as well. I don't think there's a single series that I didn't start this year, so I don't know why I mentioned that. But anyway, that series is a duology, and it's the Takes Land duology by Arkady Martin. I only have the second book here right now because I lent the first book to a friend. As you can tell from all of my videos so far in my year-end wrap-up, I lend out a lot of books. But yeah, the Takes Land duology is a space opera, political space opera, science fiction novel. Obviously, it's a space opera. Obviously, it's sci-fi. And it absolutely is now one of my favorite series of all time. I also have a full review on this one, so I will leave that link down below and up there. But mostly what I loved about this so much is the themes of colonialism, of belonging, of wanting to belong to a society that is not your own and that makes you feel like you are lesser because of who you are and because of where you come from. And so there's so many themes surrounding that, and so much world building done surrounding that, and so much introspection done with the characters surrounding that. And I just thought it was absolutely beautifully done. Then also Arkady Martin just has beautiful writing. It's like absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Also, I said I'd tell you what the series are about. So this series follows Mahid, who is sent as an ambassador from her little space station to the center of this big empire, and she needs to make sure that this empire doesn't annex her little space station. And so yeah, it's just beautifully written. A lot of language plays, and a lot done with language, because Arkady Martin, if I remember correctly, is also a linguist, and she's also a historian, so there's a lot of historical influences, historical colonial influences, especially also when it comes to the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine colonialism. So yeah, it's just beautiful duology, cannot recommend it high enough. The next series I have that I also started and finished this year is the Inheritance trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. This is a trilogy where I don't think I gave any of the single books in this trilogy 5 stars, but the series as a whole 100% is a solid 5-star for me. It's kind of hard to explain what the series is about, because in each book we follow different characters, even though all of the characters and all of the stories are connected. But basically this is set in this world where at the beginning of the story, like thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, gods were chained by mortals and now have to do the bidding of mortals. And we follow our main character, who is called to the capital city and called to the ruling family basically, and she has to take part in a competition to win the throne. Generally, I don't think it's called the throne, or it was called the throne, but you know, she has to take part in a competition to become ruler of this world. And so yeah, I just really loved this. I thought at the very beginning, or when I read the second book and started the third book, that, you know, while we follow the same world and while we follow characters that are somewhat connected to each other, even though there's decades between the books, I thought that was the only connection between the single books. But once I finished the trilogy as a whole, which I 100% recommend, even though they're not too directly connected to each other, I 100% recommend to binge this series. But once I finished this series, I noticed how well central themes were woven throughout the entire book. I don't remember what the themes were right now, funnily enough, but I do have a full review of this one as well, so definitely go and check it out. I actually have reviews for most of the books here, I believe. But yeah, just once again, I think all of the books are either between 4 stars and 4.5 stars for me, or were between 4 and 4.5 stars for me. But the series as a whole, 100% is a solid 5-star. It's so good and I can just highly recommend it. Also, once again, it's N.K. Jemisin. N.K. Jemisin is just one of the best writers out there in terms of characters, in terms of world building, and in terms of writing style. Next, let's continue on with the few series that I am caught up on and where I did, in fact, also start those series this year. Again, I don't have any series on here that I didn't start this year. Also, in terms of caught up on, I only counted series where there's at least 2 books out so far, or I read 2 books so far. And the first is a series of novellas, and that series is The Singing Hills by Nivo. I have read the first 2 novellas so far, The Empress of Salt and Fortune and When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain. And this series is going to be a total of 5 books, I believe. And basically in this we follow a storyteller who travels this world and meets different people and collects their stories. And so each of these books follows them as they meet someone and as that someone tells them a story. And yeah, I really love it. Once again, beautiful writing style. Nivo has one of the best writing styles out there. Just so gorgeous, and it lends itself so well to storytelling. There's not too much in terms of character development and so on, of course, because those are novellas, but for our storyteller, for our main character, even though we don't get too much of them, I still think that for novellas there's just those little tidbits that make it really, really easy to fall in love with them. And then next I have the God King Chronicles by Mike Brooks. I also read the first 2 so far, which are The Black Coast and The Splinter King. The 3rd book is published this year, but I'm not 100% sure if that's gonna be the last book or not. And basically, once again, adult high fantasy, kind of hard to explain what this is about, but in the first book we have the setting of this little coastal town called Black Coast, or the Black Keep or something. Yeah, Black Keep, not Black Coast. And this coastal town, this coastal keep, has regular troubles with raiders. Now at the very beginning of the book, once again, there's raiders coming and everyone's freaking out and it's like, oh, what the fuck we're gonna do? We don't have enough people, like a lot of people are gonna die. But it turns out those raiders aren't coming to, you know, raid, but they're coming to settle and to find a truce with the people of Blackkeep, and that's where this story starts. I also have a full review on this one, but basically what I love about this the most is the world building, which is so incredibly queer and queer inclusive. I wouldn't necessarily say the world is queer normative, but the world building certainly is. Does that make sense? Like, in this world we get to see multiple different cultures, and that's something that I really, really enjoy, because we get to learn a lot about those cultures by those cultures, or by people from those different cultures clashing. And these cultures, obviously, all of the people have different expectations and different understandings of what sexuality is, of what gender is, of what queerness is. And so while they are quite queer normative in some aspects, they might not be in other aspects, or they mightn't be gender inclusive in some aspects but not in other aspects, and so on. And so I really enjoyed that part of it. I also really, really enjoyed the what's it called, the characters. I thought the characters are really well done and make it really easy to fall in love with them. I thought the plot had a good tension and had a good balance between like more action-packed parts and more military and fighting focused parts, and then more emotional parts and also more political parts. There's also a lot done with the language that people speak within this series. Once again, like, you can really tell where someone is from by how they speak. And yeah, there's just so many elements that make me really excited to continue on with this series, and that just made me love this series a lot when I read it this year. One last series where I read the entirety of the books that are out so far this year, and that is A Chorus of Dragons by Dandelion. I read the first 4 books this year. The 5th and last book will be published in April, at the end of April. And before I get into this, once again, I just wanted to quickly remind you that there's currently a read-along going on about this series, with this series, reading this series. I don't know, I can't do English today, I'm sorry, but there's currently a read-along on the Discord of my book club. I will leave all the links and infos down below, and the announcement video and everything. So yeah, if you're still interested in joining in, which I would highly recommend, we're having so much fun. There's so much brain rot and shit posting going on in the Discord currently, so yeah, definitely join us. But yes, I started the series this year. It's once again a series that's kind of hard to explain. It's adult high fantasy, once again, what a surprise. And in this first book we follow Kieran, who is the lost heir to this noble house. And we meet him at the very beginning of his story when he's imprisoned and he's talking to his jailer. And his jailer asks him to tell his life story, but then also tells him that he didn't start at the right point, and actually I'm going to tell you your life story. And so they take turns telling Kieran's life story. It's quite an interesting concept and very fun. Also, there's prophecies included. Once again, so queer, so incredibly queer. And I have a whole full review of this. Also, as you can probably tell by how much I tabbed this book, I just finished my reread of this book for the read along, and I loved it a lot. It's so much less confusing the second time around, because you kind of have some pre-existing knowledge and you're like, okay, I get it better now. But yeah, there's many shenanigans, much queerness, much pining, so much drama. I love this series a lot, and it's definitely one of my favorite series and one of my favorite books that I read this year. And the 3rd book is my favorite, like definitely my favorite so far, and I cannot wait until March to get to the reread of the 3rd book. Also, because I just realized I didn't tell you for the other series, but let me just quickly tell you what my favorite books were in each of the series that I read. For the God King Chronicles, definitely the first one, which was Black Coast. For the Singing Hills, I preferred the second one, which is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain. I honestly could not tell you what my favorite was in the Inheritance trilogy. I think the 3rd one, probably, maybe, possibly, or the first one. No, actually I think the first one. It's really hard. I like all 3 about the same amount. And in the Take Ceylon duology, I preferred the finale and the 2nd book, which was A Desolation Called Peace. And in A Chorus of Dragons, as I just mentioned, the 3rd book, which is The Memory of Souls. But now let's get to the last series that I have for my favorite series of all time. I actually did not catch up to this series this year, even though I started it, but I read 2 out of the 3 books that are published as of the end of 2021. And that series that I'm talking about is The Grace of Kings, not The Grace of Kings, The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. I love this series. This is another one of the series where I believe the series as a whole I prefer over the single books on their own. I don't think the single books would be 5 stars for me so far. I put them once again between 4 and 4.5 stars. But once I'm done with the series, I can definitely see this being a 5-star series. And as of right now, as of what I've read right now, this also stands at a 5 stars for the series as a whole. This series is probably the most difficult one to explain. It's what's it called? I don't know, I saw someone in a Discord group chat that I'm in call it like silk punk fantasy. So this is set in a world that is inspired by Eastern Asian cultures among other cultures, but those are definitely the main influences, I would say, that I can see, which, you know, is whatever. But yeah, and then the first book, at the beginning of the first book, you have this empire that united these different smaller kingdoms against their will. You know, and kingdoms don't like to be united that often. And so because of that, there's some rebellions going on, and we follow two characters who are quite different from each other, who, however, have some key roles within the rebellions against this big empire. And so yeah, this is the start of the story. However, this is also a multi-generational series spanning decades. So, you know, it's just a little tidbit of what you get going into this series. Now, the reason why I love this series is the absolutely gorgeous attention to detail, which does make it quite a dense series, so I would be aware of that going into it and would be aware that you're in the right mind space to deal with a lot of information. But I just love the attention to detail. I love how we are introduced to new stuff, because a lot of times something happens and we get to see a character for the first time and get to see what they're doing, and then over the next few chapters we're introduced to their backstory, for example. And so it's not necessarily a story told chronologically, but it's a story told in split up stories in a kind of way. And so also, while you have main characters definitely in the story that we follow the most, we also get to see a lot from side characters, and we get to see what's, for example, happening, or what has been happening at some point in a different part of this world that we didn't focus on right now, but now something is happening where we now need to know what happened in another part of the world, so we'll go back to that. And so it's just a very unique way to tell the story. Also, the characters are very fun and very amazing, and I love them a lot. There's some kick-ass female characters. I wasn't the biggest fan of how female characters were treated in the first book, have to be honest, but that was definitely rectified in the second book, and now also in the third book, what I've read so far of the third book. And so yes, definitely can recommend this series. Also, honestly, with this series I cannot tell you which one I preferred so far, because don't ask me to do that. But anyway, with all of that said, that was it for my favorite rereads and favorite series that I read in 2021. Leave your thoughts on any of the books I mentioned down below. If you have read some of the books, if you have reread some of the books, tell me what your thoughts were down below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media, as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where you read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will be left linked down below. As I said, the read along for A Chorus of Dragons is in the book club Discord, so you know, you'll find that Discord among those links. And yeah, I believe that is all that was left to say, and so with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!